The River Rescue Pull. The morning mist clung to the Mekong Delta like a shroud when Marine Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Whitefeather Hathcock first heard the distant crying. It was February 1967, and his spotter, Corporal Jenkins, had just finished adjusting the scope on Hathcock's Winchester Model 70 when the sound drifted across the water. Children's voices, desperate and terrified, cutting through the humid air like shrapnel. Hathcock lowered his rifle and squinted through the early dawn haze. Intelligence had positioned them here to observe enemy troop movements along the river corridor, but what he saw through his binoculars made his stomach tighten. A sampan boat, overloaded and listing dangerously, struggled against the current about 800 meters downstream. 12 civilians, mostly women, children and elderly villagers, clung to the sides as the vessel took on water. Behind them, barely visible through the morning fog, muzzle flashes erupted from the tree line. North Vietnamese regulars were using the fleeing civilians for target practice. "Sir, we have orders to maintain position," Jenkins whispered, reading the conflict in his sergeant's face. "Command said observe only. No engagement unless fired upon directly." Hathcock watched through his scope as an elderly man lost his grip and slipped into the muddy water. A woman, probably his daughter, reached desperately toward him while trying to hold a crying infant. The boat was sinking, the enemy was closing in, and radio protocol demanded they remain hidden. Standard sniper doctrine was clear. Maintain concealment, gather intelligence, avoid compromising the mission for civilian rescue operations. But Carlos Hathcock had never been a standard sniper. The Winchester Model 70 in his hands had been his companion through countless missions in the Mekong Delta. Its weight felt different now. Not like the instrument of death it had been designed to be, but like something that might preserve life instead of taking it. The contradiction sat heavy in his chest as he calculated wind speed and water currents with the same precision he'd once used to eliminate enemy commanders. "Jenkins, see that fallen log about 50 meters downstream from the boat?" Hathcock's voice carried a strange calm as he began calculating angles, distances and water currents with the precision that had made him legendary. "That's our anchor point." Jenkins shifted beside him, the humid February air thick with tension. The Mekong's muddy waters reflected nothing but grey sky, and somewhere in that grey, 12 people were about to die unless someone acted. The Winchester's scope revealed details that made Hathcock's training irrelevant. The infant's tiny hands reaching toward the sky, the elderly man's grey head disappearing beneath the surface, the desperate way the woman tried to balance her child while extending her arm toward her drowning father. What happened next would contradict everything Hathcock had been taught about precision shooting. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. When does following orders become harder than breaking them? What happened next would later be dismissed by some officers as reckless improvisation and celebrated by others as tactical genius. Hathcock had noticed something the fleeing civilians couldn't see from their position. The river curved sharply just ahead, creating a natural eddy where the current slowed. If he could get them to that specific point, they might have a chance. But first, he needed to create what he called a river rescue pull. Using his rifle not as a weapon, but as a precision instrument, Hathcock began targeting specific points in the water around the boat, not to kill, but to guide. His first shot struck the water directly in front of the sampan's bow, sending up a dramatic splash. The Vietnamese pilot instinctively steered away from what he assumed was enemy fire, pulling the boat slightly toward the safer current Hathcock had identified. "What are you doing?" Jenkins hissed, knowing that each shot revealed their position to enemy forces who were now actively hunting for the sniper's nest. "Teaching them to fish," Hathcock replied, his eye never leaving the scope. His second shot clipped a tree branch overhanging the water, dropping it directly into the path the boat was taking. Again, the pilot corrected course, this time steering exactly where Hathcock wanted them to go. The Winchester Model 70 had become something unprecedented, a shepherd's tool rather than a sword. In the tree line across the river, the North Vietnamese had figured out the pattern now. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions along the riverbank, converging on Hathcock's estimated location. The morning mist carried the distinctive crack of AK-47s, a sound that had haunted the Mekong Delta for years. But the Marine sniper had already calculated this response. Using the sound of their muzzle blasts to triangulate positions, he began his most audacious gamble yet, using the enemy's own suppressive fire as cover. Each time the NVA opened up with sustained bursts, Hathcock used the noise to mask his own movements, repositioning along the riverbank while continuing to fire precision shots that herded the civilian boat towards safety. To the enemy, it seemed impossible. How could one sniper be firing from so many different positions? They began concentrating their fire in the wrong areas, creating the exact distraction Hathcock needed. Jenkins provided what cover he could, but both Marines knew they were violating every rule in the manual. The humid February air filled with cordite and river mist as the impossible dance continued. Hathcock's scope revealed the terror in the civilians' faces, but also something else. A growing awareness that the shots around them were guiding rather than threatening. The pilot's steering became more deliberate, following the water splashes toward the eddy that promised safety. In that moment, the Winchester Model 70 represented something larger than military doctrine. It had become a bridge between enemies, a tool that spoke a language both sides could understand, the desire to preserve innocent life. 20 minutes into the rescue, sweat mixed with river moisture on Hathcock's forehead as he calculated his next impossible shot. What transforms a weapon of war into an instrument of mercy? 27 minutes into the rescue, the sampan reached the eddy. But now the boat was taking on serious water, and the elderly man who had fallen earlier was weakening fast in the current. Hathcock made a decision that violated every rule in the sniper manual. He stood up. Exposing himself fully, Whitefeather used hand signals to direct the civilians toward a partially submerged sandbar he had spotted earlier. The enemy immediately concentrated fire on his position, but Hathcock had already calculated their range and accuracy limitations in the morning mist. Moving with deliberate calm, he continued signaling while Jenkins provided covering fire from their original hide. The Winchester Model 70 hung across his back as he became a human lighthouse in the Mekong Delta's grey dawn. Every survival instinct screamed against standing exposed like this, but something deeper than training had taken hold. These weren't strategic targets or enemy combatants. They were a grandmother clutching a baby, children who reminded him of his own nephew back in Arkansas, an old man whose eyes held the same resignation Hathcock had seen in his grandfather's face during the Depression. One by one, the civilians made it to the sandbar. The elderly man was pulled from the water by two younger villagers. The woman with the infant found solid footing. But 3 children remained trapped as the sampan finally rolled over completely. "Sir, we need to move," Jenkins called from their position. The NVA were adjusting their fire, getting closer to Hathcock's exposed position with each volley. This was when Hathcock performed the maneuver that would earn him both a commendation and a reprimand. Slinging his rifle across his back, he low-crawled through 50 meters of marsh grass under direct enemy fire, reached the water's edge, and created what he later described as a human rope, using his own body as an anchor point, while Jenkins and 2 Marines who had heard the firefight formed a chain to pull the 3 children to safety. The muddy water of the Mekong soaked through his fatigues as he stretched into the current. His left hand gripped a fallen branch, while his right reached toward the smallest child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 6. For a moment, their eyes met across the cultural and linguistic divide. And Hathcock saw something that would stay with him forever, pure trust in the face of terror. The February heat and humidity made every breath feel like drowning, but the human chain held. One child, then two, then the third, were pulled to safety on the sandbar. The Winchester Model 70 on his back felt heavier now, weighted with new meaning. As helicopter support finally appeared on the horizon, Hathcock realized he had just redefined what precision shooting could accomplish. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Can a rifle become an instrument of salvation instead of destruction? The entire rescue took 2 hours and 47 minutes. When helicopter support finally arrived to extract both the civilians and the Marine team, Hathcock was treating a shrapnel wound on his left shoulder and cleaning river mud from his rifle scope. The Winchester Model 70's optics had fogged in the humid Mekong air, but its purpose had crystallized with startling clarity. As the Huey settled onto a dry patch of riverbank, Hathcock watched the 12 Vietnamese civilians huddled together in the elephant grass. The old man he'd seen fall into the water was breathing heavily, but alive. The woman still held her infant, both of them staring at the American soldiers with expressions that mixed gratitude and confusion. The 3 children he'd pulled from the capsized sampan stayed close to their elders, their dark eyes following every movement of their unlikely rescuers. Sergeant Hathcock, the helicopter crew chief, called over the rotorwash. "We need to move. Intelligence reports heavy NVA movement in this sector." But something made Hathcock pause. The youngest child, the 6-year-old girl whose hand he'd grasped in the muddy water, approached him hesitantly. In her small fist, she clutched something that glinted in the February sunlight filtering through the delta's perpetual haze. It was a brass shell casing, one of his spent rounds from the Winchester Model 70. She had retrieved it from the sandbar and polished it clean with her sleeve. Without speaking, she pressed it into his palm and bowed slightly, the way children are taught to show respect to elders. The weight of that brass casing felt enormous. Here was physical evidence of the morning's impossible mathematics, a bullet that had been fired not to end life, but to preserve it. The girl's simple gesture transformed the casing from battlefield debris into something approaching sacred. "Sir?" Jenkins appeared at his elbow, field pack ready, eyes constantly scanning the tree line for muzzle flashes. "Load them up," Hathcock said quietly, nodding toward the civilians. "All of them?" The crew chief started to protest. Protocol, capacity limits, questions about civilian transport, but something in Hathcock's tone ended the discussion. The 12 Vietnamese civilians climbed aboard the Huey with the same careful dignity they had shown throughout their ordeal. During the flight back to base, Hathcock turned the brass casing over in his palm. The Winchester Model 70 rested between his knees, its familiar weight now carrying new meaning. Through the helicopter's open door, the Mekong Delta stretched endlessly below, a maze of waterways where enemies and allies, hunters and hunted, could change roles in the span of a single morning. The little girl sat near the front of the cabin, still watching him. When their eyes met, she smiled, not the desperate gratitude of a refugee, but the simple joy of a child who had witnessed something beautiful in the middle of something terrible. That smile would follow Hathcock back to base camp and into the debates that were already beginning. How do you measure the value of 12 lives against military protocol? The after-action report sparked heated debate at division headquarters. Some officers argued that Hathcock had endangered his unit and compromised intelligence gathering for an unauthorized humanitarian mission. Others pointed out that his unconventional use of precision fire as a herding tool had potential applications for crowd control and civilian protection scenarios. Major Patterson, the intelligence officer who had briefed Hathcock on the original observation mission, sat across from him in the debriefing room at Can Tho Base. Between them lay the formal incident report, 2 pages of military bureaucracy that could never capture what had actually happened on the river. "Sergeant, your orders were explicit. Observe and report enemy troop movements. No engagement unless directly fired upon." "Yes, sir." "Yet you discharged 37 rounds, exposed your position, and abandoned your observation post to conduct an unauthorized rescue operation." "Yes, sir." Major Patterson studied the Winchester Model 70 that lay disassembled for cleaning on the adjacent table. Its components gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the debriefing room, but somehow the weapon looked different now. Even broken down into its constituent parts, it seemed to carry the weight of its morning's work. "Explain to me how this serves our mission in the Delta, Sergeant." Hathcock reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the brass casing the child had given him. He placed it carefully on the desk between them. "Sir, that little girl picked this up from the sandbar, one of my spent rounds. She cleaned it and gave it back to me like it was something precious. I don't understand the relevance. She turned my bullet into a gift, sir, made me think about what we're really fighting for out here." Major Patterson picked up the casing, turning it over in his palm. Standard 7.62mm NATO, nothing special about it except for the circumstances of its firing. But Hathcock's next words would stay with him long after the debriefing ended. "Those 12 people aren't going home telling their neighbors that American soldiers are monsters, sir. They're going to remember that we risked our lives to save theirs. That Winchester didn't take 12 lives this morning, it preserved them. Maybe that matters more than following orders to the letter." The debate would continue for weeks. Some officers would call it reckless endangerment. Others would quietly file away the concept of precision herding for future tactical consideration. But the real measure of success walked through the villages of the Mekong Delta in the form of an elderly man who could still embrace his grandchildren, a woman who could still nurse her infant, and 3 children who would grow up remembering the day enemy soldiers became their guardian angels. The brass casing remained on Hathcock's desk throughout his remaining tour, a small reminder that sometimes the most precise shot is the one that shows everyone else where not to go. What happens when mercy becomes more important than mission? But for the 12 Vietnamese civilians who made it home that day, and for the Marines who witnessed Whitefeather's river rescue pull, the debate missed the point entirely. They had seen something that couldn't be quantified in tactical manuals or strategic doctrine. They had seen a sniper use his deadliest tool not to take life, but to preserve it. Years later, Corporal Jenkins would tell his own children that he learned more about marksmanship watching Hathcock shoot to save than he ever had watching him shoot to kill. Sometimes, Jenkins would say, the most precise shot is the one that shows everyone else where not to go. The Winchester Model 70 returned with Hathcock to Arkansas in 1969, but it carried more than just the scars of combat. In the rifle's wooden stock, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a small depression where the brass casing had rested during those final months in Vietnam. Hathcock had pressed it there often enough to wear away the finish, a nervous habit that reminded him of a 6-year-old girl's simple act of gratitude. Back home, at family gatherings and veteran reunions, people would ask about his confirmed kills, his famous duels with enemy snipers, his legendary status as Whitefeather. But Hathcock rarely spoke of those things. When pressed, he would sometimes tell about a morning in the Mekong Delta when precision shooting meant something entirely different. 12 people, he would say quietly. That's what I'm most proud of. His nephew, a boy about the same age as the Vietnamese child who had given him the casing, would run his small fingers along the Winchester's stock and ask why his uncle looked sad when he cleaned his rifle. Because, son, sometimes the hardest thing about war isn't learning to shoot, it's remembering what you're supposed to be protecting. The brass casing lived on Hathcock's mantelpiece for decades, polished smooth by time and touch. Visitors who noticed it among his other military memorabilia would sometimes ask about its significance. Hathcock would pick it up, feeling its familiar weight, and for a moment he would be back in the humid air of the Delta, watching 12 strangers trust him with their lives. "A little girl gave this to me," he would explain. "Taught me that bullets can build bridges just as easily as they can burn them down." When Carlos Hathcock passed away in 1999, the brass casing was among his most treasured possessions. At his funeral, attended by Marines and civilians alike, Jenkins spoke about the river rescue pull and the lesson it taught about precision and purpose. The Winchester Model 70 lay in its case, retired but not forgotten, a reminder that sometimes the most important targets are the ones you choose not to hit. The casing now rests in a display case at the Marine Corps Museum, labeled simply, "Precision Fire for Life Preservation, Mekong Delta, February 1967. Visitors often pause before it, puzzled by the understated description, but occasionally someone understands. They see in that simple piece of brass the profound truth that Carlos Hathcock discovered on a misty morning in Vietnam. That the ultimate expression of a sniper's skill might not be taking a life at impossible range, but preserving 12 lives through impossible compassion. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What memories will you polish smooth with time and touch?